This is live now? Okay, if we could assemble, we're going to get started, please. I think we have a few members of the steering committee that are not yet here, but I think we're going to get going. If we could put the presentation up, please. Okay, I'm going to call the meeting of the steering committee to order. And I'm going to start with a roll call vote of the members of the steering committee. Mr. Budish.
Here.
Sheriff Ilan.
Here.
Mr. Sweeney.
Here.
Ms. Bird.
Here.
Judge Celebrezzi. Here. Mr. Gallagher.
Here.
Judge Sheehan. Here. Mr. O'Malley. Judge Early. Here. And Mr. Mark Griffin. Here. And we're still waiting for Mr. Blaine Griffin and Kim Bates, and we'll note when they arrive, if they arrive. Today, obviously, we're doing this meeting here in council chambers. The meeting is being live streamed. I will point out that there are sheets in back. If there's anybody here that is going to offer public comment, please sign the sheet for public comment that is in the back of the room. And we will have public comment after the presentation. Today, we are returning to a discussion of primarily the courts. We'll have the briefest of updates as to where we are on site selection for the jail, but today this is all about the return to not just the courts, but every other function in the current Justice Center other than the jail. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Andy Couples from DLR is here today, and he's going to lead us through this conversation. I want to make a couple introductory points. Number one, we are not voting on anything today. We're not asking for any decisions today. This is all about just providing you a lot of information. As you'll recall, we started down this process looking at the building as a whole. And we did a lot of programming over the course of over a year prior to COVID hitting. And that involved over 650 working group sessions with various parties. I think this is our 15th steering committee meeting. I could be off by one or two, but it's something like 15 steering committee meetings. There came a point in time, by the way, right before COVID hit, when the base programming had actually been done for the Justice Center functions. And by that, what I mean is that every party that operates in the Justice Center or works in the Justice Center, because there's ancillary functions in the old courthouse, in Courthouse Square, but everyone had been interviewed by our team, and there was an assessment made of what I would say are the legitimate requests and desires of everybody. How are they operating? What is insufficient? What would be preferable? And in a perfect world where there was money to pay for it all, what would we do? What would you do to program? At that point in time, we went on as a steering committee. The decisions were made as to what to do with the jail, and we left open the option of what to do with the courthouse. Those options included some form of renovation and keeping functions in place, some form of build new, or a combination of the two. And that was what was left for consideration. What you're going to, and we got to COVID, and obviously this process, the world changed, and we had some delays and disruptions. We also had to consider the impact of COVID. What kind of new universe are we working in? We were actually prepared to get back to this point in April of last year. In fact, we did working group sessions on exactly what you're going to see today with many of you. But at that point in time, that meeting didn't go forward. The focus was more on the jail up until now. Now we're ready to go back and talk more about what happens with Justice Center functions. And we're going to go about this in two ways. First of all, Andy is going to lead you through a discussion of where all that programming was. What did we discover? What are the spaces we need to take care of? What are the desires, and what are the things that every unit of government in that building legitimately, should have, legitimately is looking for as part of a going forward process? And what would that look like if we either built a new building or if we did a total renovation of the existing building and some combination, because some you do have to build new, you can't get everything within the existing building. What would that look like and what would it cost? Now, one way that you always start these programs is to do that evaluation. Inevitably, what occurs, and it occurs in virtually every project, is that you look at that and there is total sticker shock as to what that would actually be in a perfect world. And you will see those numbers, and you will understand the sticker shock, because I'm not kidding you. I mean, there's no secret that that's true. Then the question is, okay, now we go from what everyone would legitimately want to what is absolutely needed, and how would you modify a program to look at needs, and how would you prioritize them? So you take the program from the top down and look how you might adjust it. And you also do an exercise in the other direction, which is to say, if we had X amount of money to spend, if we have a budget, if there's only so much money and we have that much money, what would we do with it? How would we prioritize? What do we have to do first? What do we have to do second? And what are the things we have to accomplish? We'd also have to go back even to the 2013 assessment, because that told you everything in the building that needs to be fixed. What it doesn't tell you is the absolute priority. What do we have to do tomorrow? What can we wait 3 years on? What's the priority and the expenditure? So that's the next stage. But right now, I'm going to turn it over to Andy, and what we're going to do is, after we tell you the initially programmatically everything that could be there and what this would look like, we're then going to go through and talk about options for you to think about. No decision is made on any of these. There's some things that are going to be suggested that you may completely reject out of hand, but at least we want to talk about what the things are that need to be thought about now in the coming months as we continue to work through the process. So with that, Andy, I think that's the lead in, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for the opportunity to be here in person. It's great to have an in-person meeting for a change. I won't have to ask anybody to unmute or anything today, so it's going to be pretty good. Anyway, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today. We're first going to look at what the outcome was of the programming process, and then perhaps look at some ideas which could help us move the project forward. We kind of called, I think last year I called it 1 year later. This year we're calling it 1 + 1 year later, because most of this work was completed, as Jeff said, in March of 2020, before the pandemic hit, so we could move forward with the courts. As you may recall, in November, the decision was made to relocate the jail to a new site. That effectively eliminated 2 of the earlier options. One was to reuse the entire existing complex, including the jail. The other option was to move the courts with the jail. The decision which was left were 2 options: renovate and expand the courthouse in place, or build a new courthouse on a site downtown. As Jeff pointed out, we did go through a very, very detailed programming exercise. And one thing I want to point out, this is not a wish list. This is based upon national standards. It's based on best practices, things that have been done elsewhere. It's based upon a very strong working relationship with all the courts involved in the project. Secondly, it also reflects, in total, the rules of superintendents as adopted by the Supreme Court in terms of ratio of judges to criminal capable jury courtrooms, provision of jury rooms for every courtroom. Those things were givens that we had to base the program on. The one thing that you'll see as we go through this is that there has been an increase in litigation spaces. That's not an increase in courtrooms. It's an increase in space for magistrates. One of the things we saw as we went through this is the conditions that the Domestic Relations Court is working under with doing large volatile hearings basically in a small chamber. The magistrates do not have litigation spaces. The same is true for the housing court. So there are some areas where there are simply deficiencies which did drive the program area. So this basically gives you a summary of what the total area requirement would be. We're looking at a projected need for about 953,000 usable square feet. That's the actual space that's usable for chambers, for offices, for public counters, for courts, for litigation space. Now, if you compare that to what you have now, you're currently at about 700,000 square feet. Some of those major shortfalls are in domestic relations court, housing court. That's the typical courtroom size we would use today for planning, which is slightly larger than what you have now. That translates into a building of about a program of about 1.2 billion square feet, a very, very large program of area need. This diagram gives you an idea of where the shortfalls are occurring. Some of the most critical ones, as I mentioned, are domestic relations, housing court, the prosecutor, who basically has offices which are planned as single offices with 2 attorneys in them, which makes it very, very difficult to deal with attorney-client privilege when doing interviews and other things. So that's what really drove the program, was looking at what the true space standards are today. One of the other questions that has come up throughout this as we've done our working group meetings is, why is everybody involved? Why are we including prosecutor, public defender, all the other agencies? That was our charge. Our charge was to look at all the agencies that make up the court system. And as you may recall, at the time you made the determination of what the options were, you also made a determination to have us take a look at the Court of Appeals and probate court. It opted initially not to be part of the project, but given they're also part of the court system, and this is a total system project, the steering committee directed that that their needs should also be looked at. This is just an example of what's in the final program. It's basically driven by what is current staffing, what are the space standards, which generates how much area is needed for the justice system. This diagram gives you an illustration of the difference between your current courtroom and the courtroom standard we would use for planning a newer facility. The difference is the existing courtrooms are about 1,440 square feet. We typically start looking at around 1,800 square feet for a full jury-capable courtroom. One of the key reasons for that, and you'll see it on this diagram, is ramps for accessibility. Accessibility for the witness, accessibility for the jury, accessibility for the clerk's workstation. Typically today, every courtroom is fully and completely accessible, because we can't just do it in one or another, because we don't know when a witness is going to require accessibility. We don't know when a juror is going to require accessibility. So pretty much the standard across the board is that courtrooms should be 100% accessible. This is not about design, but one of the things we want to make clear as we work with all the members of the bench, that the standards provide for all kinds of different opportunities for how a courtroom can be laid out, from a typical center bench courtroom to a corner bench, which is prevalent in some courthouses today, to an off-center bench, that the space standard allows that and does allow for full accessibility in the well. Again, one of the areas we saw a shortfall in was litigation spaces for magistrates. So 2 types of spaces are in the program for magistrates: a formal hearing room with a raised bench, and a smaller T-shaped conference room hearing room for settlements. And again, we were trying to look at different sizes of rooms as part of that notion of limiting how much space was actually needed in terms of planning and budgeting. We did go through, when we started this, a series of visioning sessions with every court and every stakeholder. All the courts are represented on the steering committee, the housing court as well. And then when we added the appeals court and the probate court, we met with them, the prosecutor's office, the public defender, to talk about what were the needs and based on how they work. So this is really was to pick up on what Jeff said. This was a bottom-up approach to determine the needs based on operations. And then, again, as I said, this is about 2 years down the line. In March, my team got together and really started to vet out these options. Once we had the program, and the space needs, and we reviewed those with the various working groups, we started to look at how we could make these options reality. So the first option is that the jails are going to move off the site, and we're going to expand and renovate the courthouse on the existing site. I emphasize that because that's something we may want to consider going forward, and I'll show you why in a moment. Our general deployment assumptions were to try to renovate full floors at a time, to limit the schedule where we could, to find operational and functional adjacencies that would improve the operations of the court. You know, it's fairly typical, a building that's built occupied in 1977. Over time, people move around, and you lose kind of that sense of adjacency for functions. So I think this is important when we think about the future, because this is one of the issues that drives the cost of an expand and renovate scheme. Doing it on the existing site is dependent upon when the jail is complete. So first, we have to build the new jail and move. Second, we have to do some kind of a temporary sally port, as we kind of sketched it out, to get to the 5th floor of the PAB to connect to the courthouse so we can continue to deliver in-custody defendants to the courtrooms. And then we demolish the Jail 1 and Jail 2. That adds about 3 to 4 years to the courthouse project as a renovation scheme. So one of the things to think about going forward, is there a way to accelerate the project and not lose that 3 to 4 years to escalation? So what would this look like? Once the jail was removed, the first thing we would be suggesting would be actually building an annex. The intent of that annex is to really provide swing space so that we can vacate floors in the existing courthouse to allow for renovation. One of the other things that drove this project was a sense that if we did this, we would bring the building completely back up to year 0 in terms of its life cycle. Systems, building skin, everything in the building. So phase 4 is that annex, which is our interim swing space. And then we do a series of renovations to the tower. This was initially based upon doing 4 floors at a time. Even after we did that, we went back, actually after our working groups last year, and recast it to suggest it needs to be done 8 floors at a time or more in order to shorten the construction schedule, because every year adds another amount of compounded escalation to the cost of the project. At about the middle of this schedule, we would basically move the municipal courts into the annex permanently. You know, once we get through the first few courts floors phases of renovation, we then have municipal court in the annex. We then move domestic relations court into the courts tower. Again, this was based upon consolidation of all the courts that were part of this project in the Justice Center. Finish the renovation. And at the point in time we did this project, we were assuming that the PAB, the old PAB, would be replaced with the new office building for office functions, probation, public defender, et cetera. Since that time, the county started to make investments into the police administration building. So another way to think about perhaps reducing the cost of renovation and expansion is to investigate if the PAB can be used for part of the program without replacing it. And then finally, in all of our options, we included a budget line item for additional parking, which would be something which I'm sure will continue to be discussed as a project would be developed. A couple of the key issues when we look at that renovation is how the existing courtrooms function. Currently, none of the courtrooms have accessibility provisions for the public or for judges. So we did do a quick diagram simply to say, could we make these courtrooms accessible? Because if we couldn't, then that would probably suggest we need to do a replacement building. So we did a diagram, which is not necessarily the final plan, which, as you can see, illustrates a ramp. Actually, the rear hallway is pretty wide, so we take 3 feet out of it to get up the first 6 inches or 8 inches, and then a second ramp to get to the judge's bench. That also gets us to a clerk or a workstation in the courtroom. You also see a ramp that leads to the witness stand into the raised jury box, and then a ramp on the backside so the jury can get to the jury room. Effectively today, virtually every courthouse we do, all courtrooms are 100% accessible. There was a lot of discussion during our working groups that, well, we're not required to do that by code. And that's absolutely true. The code official is not going to come in and say you have to do this unless you spend a certain amount of money relative to the value of the building. But accessibility is a major issue and a major issue of concern that should be considered by the steering committee. We also wanted to look to see if we could, in fact, accommodate domestic relations in the way they work. Domestic relations basically is a judge with 2 assigned magistrates. So we wanted to look, is there a way to get a renovated courtroom on a floor along with a formal hearing room and a smaller hearing room so that we can support the operational idea that of the team approach of the judge and 2 magistrates. Again, these were very quick diagrams because while we could block and stack and play with area numbers, we needed to know the major functions could actually be accommodated in a renovation of the tower. So basically, this is a block and stack, and we have a large block and stack of how we put the building together. But the top 8 floors are the common pleas courtrooms. Then the common pleas magistrates, county prosecutor floors, working our way down domestic relations with 3 floors in the building, very high volume functions remaining on the lower level, including the housing court. The housing court, we really think needs some very specialized consideration for planning so that they can continue to work off hours, because a lot of their clientele is working during the day, but still needs to avail themselves of the services of the court. As I indicated, the 1 annex would become basically the municipal courts. And that also, when we build that annex, we rebuild a sally port, a connection to the 5th floor, so that we can use all the elevators for delivery of in-custody defendants to the courts. I neglected to mention that the renovation of the courts would also include increase in holding capacity, provide for an interview room for public defenders, attorneys, and clients at the courtroom, as well as provide for accessibility for holding. During one of my working group meetings, I think Judge Sheehan with the Common Pleas Court, they actually were talking about a defendant that came in a wheelchair and how they could make provisions for that person. And we also suggested, in order to try to drive the price down, to look at doing more floors at a time. That may require some other considerations in working with the courts to make it happen. But if we can reduce the total delivery time on the project, well, we will reduce the escalation, which will go into making up the budget. The other option would be to acquire a site downtown and to build a new courthouse to meet the total needs. And again, it's based upon all portions of the justice system with all options for the Court of Appeals and probate, which were studied separately. So again, general deployment assumptions, test fitted on a site. You'll see some test fits. They were primarily done simply to determine how big a site would we need to acquire in downtown. Consolidation of court support functions, including domestic relations. As I said, alternatives for the Court of Appeals and Common Pleas probate divisions. One of the key issues that came out, and you'll see it in a moment in our work with working groups, was instead of 4 courts per floor, as we have in the Justice Center, to consider planning on 8 courts per floor, so that we can have a lower rise structure, an easier ability to move throughout the building, the potential to even interconnect floors with escalators or stairs, because you have public defenders are in many different courtrooms, prosecutors are moving between courtrooms, private attorneys also, so we can get away from totally relying on elevators for all of our movement in the building. So basically, what we believe, and you'll see in a moment, is it would take about a site of 2 city blocks, 2 full city blocks, in order to do a lower rise solution. It was based upon the rules of superintendents and the module that the courts are used to working with, which is 2 jury courtrooms sharing a holding area, with chambers and jury rooms immediately adjacent on private circulation. As I said, in our working groups, we did raise questions about 4, 8, 12, 16 courts per floor to help generate this notion of what we needed for a site. And I think where we came down in terms of the programming and planning was that 8 courts per floor seemed to be a pretty ideal solution. What that looks like is basically 4 of those double courtroom modules, One of the things you'll note in this, the yellow is actually the public area. One of the things we see in the existing Justice Center is we have 4 courts that face a common area, so we end up with defendants, witnesses, victims, all in the same waiting area. By doing something a bit different, we can allow for self-separation in the public area. Can also provide a view, some of the biophilic notions of how we can reduce stress for the public that's using the courthouse, the courts facility in a new building. And again, this is not about design. The building could take many shapes and forms. This was really just to test, to look at blocking and stacking and look at what we would need for a site. So some of our general deployment assumptions is there would be restricted parking below the building. The building would probably be partially raised to give it that gravitas sense of approaching a courthouse. We suggest a campus approach so that we can separate out office functions from court functions, because building to an office grid is less expensive than building to a courtroom grid in terms of the structural spans. Also, having a separate identifiable wing for domestic relations, because they do have a different clientele than common pleas in municipal court. So those are some of the ideas that went into of how we would arrange a new building. You see on the screen, basically 2 wings of 4 courts, still 8 courts per floor, but trying to, again, break things apart in terms of where we have all the public waiting. A separate office wing for public defender and probation. It connected to the courthouse, but yet it gives it a separate identity, and it does not have to be built to the same floor-to-floor heights and structural grids as we would do a courthouse. And then a separate wing for domestic relations, which would include housing court, so that housing court could have a separate entry to allow it to operate extended hours without opening the entire Justice Center. Again, it could take several different forms. We simply used one as a basis for estimating. Our estimate was driven by the program and by what the building area would be. Basically, this building's about half the height of the Justice Center because of the 8 courts per floor plan. We end up with 4 floors for common pleas court that could be interconnected, as I said, with stairs. We'd end up with 2 floors for municipal court. The same thing could be interconnected but with stairs. And then our more higher volume functions on the lower level with a separate wing for domestic relations and an office building, interconnected office building for probation, office functions, and the public defender. When we compare those, obviously new construction meets all of our criteria for operational flexibility, programmatic suitability, et cetera. The renovation scheme has some significant shortfalls in terms of future expansion and adaptation, some impact on operational efficiency because we don't gain that notion of getting more courts on a floor. The bigger issues, actually the issues that affect budgeting, which is impact on operations during construction. We really don't believe, looking at this, that we could find enough resources to vacate the building and have the ability to do in custody matters in a different building. So we would be doing this with it partially occupied. Construction logistics, the probability of off-hours work. So this gives you an idea of how these are going to compare budget-wise. And I want to emphasize that one thing as we look at this comparison, there is no costs in here for a site. This is just pure construction costs, so the cost of the new construction would have to be adjusted to include site acquisition. So basically, under option 2A, which is to basically renovate and expand in place, we'd be spending about $200 million on new construction on the existing site. 2 elements: the annex I mentioned, which is constructed for swing space and to meet the total needs of the program. And then if we did a future office building to replace the police administration building. So the new construction, pure construction, is about $650 million for 1.2 billion square feet. We got to add to that project costs, and there are, the escalation contingencies. This is where the new construction was affected by that delay in start. Because rather than assuming it's going to be 4 years to build the building, we have to assume it's 7 years because we've got to allow for the time to replace the jail and demolish it. The bigger issue is what is the condition of the existing Justice Center? We did not do a full and complete review. We used the information that was gathered in 2014, so it's about 8 years out of date. It suggested at that time that there was about $162 million in deferred maintenance repairs needed. Now, since that time, the county has done regular maintenance on parts of the building, but we still have a building which is 1977 vintage and is in need of some fairly significant upgrades. And again, to that, we've got to add the cost of impacting it while it's occupied and project costs, which means we'd be looking at a deferred maintenance cost of about $365 million if we did everything. And that's what Jeff was suggesting. Another issue to be considered as we look at this as an option is what is independent of the functional renovations. Obviously, if we were going to redo a court floor, we would take care of the systems while we're on that floor, but the exterior envelope could be a separate project and potentially we need to be looked at in terms of, is it immediately necessary or what's the time frame that would trigger that need? At the time this estimate was done, there was a unsubstantiated independent estimate, which was talked about in our working groups, which said it could be done for about $100 million. But again, if we escalate that, it comes to 150. If we add the project costs, we're still looking at $240 million just for deferred maintenance. The reason that's, and just as an example, this is the Portland building, Michael Graves' Portland building, county office building in Portland, Oregon. About the same vintage, maybe 3 years newer than the Justice Center. They had to go through a complete renovation as we're discussing, and we just use this as an example. They ended up spending 6 times the original construction cost based on what it took to do the full renovation. So I don't think the numbers we're talking about in terms of the size of the Justice Center and just age-based need for upgrades is out of line. So what does that do? Well, the cost of renovations are about $429 million. But again, renovation while occupied, we have to assume that there's going to be times when construction work is going to be stopped. We have to assume we may have to do all of our logistics at night. We have to assume that there'll be off-hours work in that kind of a project. So we can't just use what we think the raw construction cost is. There is a premium to renovate an occupied courthouse. And then the second issue is that schedule, which drives a significant amount of escalation. So if in fact this option makes sense to the courts family and to the steering committee, looking at how we could start it sooner and how we could get it done sooner would significantly reduce the impact of escalation on that budget. So we're looking at a comparison of about $1.2 billion to about $818 million without a new site. So if we put the site costs on that, the numbers are a bit closer together. So again, this just gives you a sense of that overall comparison. In fact, you'll note that the actual construction cost is slightly less than new construction. But it's the, yeah.
I want to be clear that that 1.2 you're taking from the page before, the new construction, the annex, and adding it to the full renovation, that's where you're at 1.2. It's not all on one page. So that was confusing for some people. I just want to make that clear.
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, the first page was new construction costs. The second page added the renovation costs. But it's the project costs, renovating while occupied, the time it takes to get there, which has a huge impact on option 2A, renovation and expand in place. Just briefly, we did look at the needs of the Court of Appeals and the probate division. They've been very cooperative and participated in every working group meeting we've had. Again, we looked at what their projected space needs were. One of the biggest issues in that building now is because they're mixed with domestic relations. They don't have contiguous space or for operations. I believe the Court of Appeals is still using 2 hearing rooms on the first floor with the rest of the court up above. The same with probate court spread throughout the building, mixed because of domestic relations on part of the second floor or the second floor. I'll get it straight. But So there are things to be considered in terms of their needs. And identified three things to look at. What if they both remain? What would we do? This would be after domestic relations would vacate. What if probate relocates to new and the Court of Appeals expands in place? And what if both of those courts were included as part of the Justice Center, either option 2A, renovate and expand in place, or a new building? And again, with the old courthouse, there's also some deferred maintenance that needs to be considered if we're going to do a major renovation project. But the same kinds of considerations I mentioned for the Justice Center could be worked into that also. What needs to be done to support the functional changes versus what could be approached as a separate project. So we did look at three options. This option was based upon a horizontal consolidation, with the Court of Appeals taking all of level 2, probate taking all of level 3, and some of level 1. I would point out in our follow-up discussions, probate would prefer an east-west divide in stacking the building vertically. That would be the same amount of space, would just be a different way of accommodating the needs if we move forward with this option. We do gain about 55,000 square feet whenever domestic relations moves out. So that may be another way to help solve a portion of the program if the old courthouse is part of an overall scheme of renovation, reuse, and expansion. We also suggested if probate relocated, then Court of Appeals would basically take the second floor, and we'd gain about 102,000 square feet for potential other uses. We do not believe leaving domestic relations in the old courthouse is a good answer. I probably didn't emphasize this enough. I'm sure the judge will jump in and help me in terms of safety, security. You basically have magistrates with 6 or 8 people in their small chamber with only one way out. It's not a very good situation for the public. It really doesn't reflect the role of the courts and the matters they're doing. And it's really got an issue in terms of safety and security. There is no private circulation effectively in most of the domestic relations space.
I do agree with you. And in terms of like our domestic violence department, we don't have a separate area for respondents and victims. So we have that issue. We have magistrates doing domestic violence hearings in their offices with no way to get out of the office should something happen. Same with our trial magistrates, have no way out of their office should something happen in a hearing. So domestic relations court is a much different court than common pleas. We see good people usually at their worst. And so I appreciate the fact that you understand the needs of our court.
Thank you, Judge. So if we were to include them in new construction, we would basically have to increase the size of new construction because effectively our base scheme for 2A filled everything up. So we'd basically add floors to the annex for probate and the Court of Appeals. And similarly, if it was a new construction, it would be additional floors, increasing the size of the new building. And again, the same thing is pretty much true that in new construction, we can absolutely meet everything that's required for the program, location, and eliminate developmental impacts. One of the judges in our working group also pointed out that new construction would reduce the safety, security, operational cost of operating 2 buildings. So there are some advantages, we believe, to considering new construction. I would point out, though, that both courts have indicated, Court of Appeals has indicated they want to stay in the old courthouse, as has Judge Russo from probate court. So we looked at that from a cost perspective, and even with the $50 million of upgrading the old courthouse, if we did a full upgrade of what was identified in the 2015 study, it's comparable to new construction. If we start to split it and do both, then we're also paying for that cost to upgrade the old courthouse, so the cost goes up substantially if we put probate in new construction, but leave Court of Appeals in the existing building and expand in place. So again, this gives us the same comparison, and one of the issues to think about is if it was a new construction option and they were part of new construction, we'd obviously get done much quicker. If it's included as part of the renovation expansion scheme, then it becomes something that's in a series of phases and potentially drives the time to occupancy out. So what does that mean in total to the, in terms of where we're at with looking at the program needs? If we did totally renovations, we'd be looking at total construction cost of about $683 million. If it was all new, construction would be higher at $705 million. But all those issues I mentioned earlier that drive the schedule, that drive the starting time to the renovation expansion option, drive the project costs up, along with renovating while occupied. So you'd be looking at a difference, again, of about $1.3 billion to $885 million, plus the cost of a site. I just want to emphasize that so that it's understood that there's another cost that would need to be considered. We've never had a discussion with the steering committee, with the county, the city, about what is a limit to affordability in terms of where we need to go. So what we did for this discussion is say, what if it was 400 million, 500 million, 600 million, 700 million? What would that mean in terms of how we'd have to look at the program of needs? So the total program need with Court of Appeals and probate is about 1.3 billion square feet. And if we looked at a mid-range cost at 400 million, we could deal with about 41% of the program as it stands today. If we are at 500 million, we could do it about 54%. You know, it just gives you an idea. This really just sets an idea of what if we had to look at scope reduction based on affordability and budget available, what would it mean in terms of the total needs as projected? So with that, we did not want this to, first of all, the numbers are pretty shocking. I think every time we presented them in working groups, we've gotten that same response in terms of the numbers. We didn't want it to be, here's the numbers, what do we want to do? We wanted to say, if there's an issue of affordability from the perspective of the county and the city and the steering committee, what could be done? Nothing I talk about in this piece are things that we're saying should be done or must be done. They're simply the kinds of things that could be considered going forward to find a level of affordability that would be less than the $1.3 billion. So we really think there's three major areas. One, what can be done to tighten up the scope? Obviously, the cost of the buildings based on how much we build or renovate. Should we consider phased implementation based on an agreed prioritization of need? What needs to be done first and what could be done later? And that could even include looking at the physical improvements, as I mentioned, to the Justice Center building itself. For example, redoing the exterior could be separated from the functional needs. And then how could we accelerate project implementation if we were doing the renovation scheme? Because as I pointed out, waiting for the jail to be demolished pushes us out 4 years and adds 4 years of escalation before we even spend $1. Ultimately, it will probably be a combination of all these that will be needed to get to a level of affordability. We've had a lot of discussions over the past 2 years about what's happening to the courts because of the pandemic. And there are a lot of different things that have happened. Judge Scott, when we talked about housing court, talked about a lot more is being done virtually and perhaps the space needs could be reduced. Some of the judges have talked about the need for in-person appearance, for the gravitas of the court and the business they do. So we think that that's something that can be looked at is how has this affected business? Actually, there's the alternate public defender in Miami no longer has any office space. They have a workroom in the courthouse because the attorneys work from their homes. You know, and if that is affecting some of your offices, you know, does that allow us to look at reducing space needs? I know my office, I'm lucky to have 20 people in it sometimes, even today. People are just, they're used to working from home. So what we did is we took the new construction model because it was very easy to manipulate it as opposed to renovation and just did some what ifs for consideration first by the courts and the court family and then by the steering committee and then ultimately by the county and the city if we had to make adjustments to reach a different level of affordability. So the first thing we said is, can we look at reducing space standards? Can we plan for courtrooms that are smaller? Can we look at a different ratio of jury rooms to courtrooms? The rules of superintendents right now say 1 jury room per courtroom. With the agreement of the bench, though, we could do something different. Do we reduce office sizes? Do we look at combining some services? What could convert files to high density? What could we do to just kind of squeeze the amount of space down from that 1.2 billion building growth, which was projected? So if we did some of those things, we just ran models, adjusting numbers, but it did reduce it by about $82 million. And there are also some other things that can be considered, you know, by the courts family and the steering committee. Do we need full jury courtrooms for every judicial position? How's technology affected it? I remember Judge Sheehan, in our working group last year, a couple of your judges talked about they were doing more from their office now. So does that allow us to think a bit differently to help to push down the amount of area we need? Could jury assembly be reduced by direct assignment of jurors? A couple jurisdictions we're working with COVID did away with the large jury assembly room, and they simply send a panel straight to a courtroom. They're told to report to a specific courtroom. So just other options that we can start to work through with the courts family to see what we can do to reduce how much we're building or renovating. Then we could also look at deferring program. The clerk of court archival storage is in the program. And quite frankly, that's another area that's very dangerous. I don't even like going in that room.
That's not nice, Andy.
Well, you know what I'm, Ms. Bird, you know what I'm talking about. File cabinets on top of file cabinets. But could that go into a warehouse kind of storage? Are there things we're storing that we don't need to be storing? You know, just starting to look at what's driving space needs. Cafeteria. Again, if we're doing a new courthouse and there are a lot of restaurants around, would we need a cafeteria? There's been discussion in working groups that it is needed for the function of the building. So, but again, we were just saying, here's some things that could be considered just to defer out of the program. And that was another almost $50 million. And there are a lot of office functions in the program currently, and there are office functions in the courthouse itself. Could some of those be considered to go into lease space or off-site space rather than into construction and renovation? Could the public defender remain in Courthouse Square and expand in that space if we move some other users out of the building? And again, these are just things we think could be looked at as another way to consider to drive down the cost of this project in terms of affordability. Should the city of Cleveland Housing Court be in a downtown lease location of their own? And we actually did discuss that in our working group with Judge Scott the other day, trying to talk about ideas that would solve immediate needs and potentially change the affordability level for the project. Although all those equal about $166 million, but if we did something else, we'd have to remember there could be an offsetting cost, whether that cost is a lease or that cost is a purchase of an office building or something else. But it does, you know, court space by its nature is fairly expensive. So if we take it out of the courthouse, maybe there's a less expensive solution. And then finally, we said, what if we did do a different mix of litigation spaces? Again, rules of superintendents is the basis for the program as it stands, because that's what we're required to do. But could we consider other choices? And that would be another $34 million. We're simply putting these ideas out here as things that could be considered by the courts family, by the county, by the city, in trying to find an answer that works for everybody, both dollar-wise for the county and the city, and function-wise for the courts family. The other thing we think that could be adjusted is to start to think about this in terms of priorities. You know, priority needs of the system, and what do we fix first, second, third, fourth? Again, this is from our perspective. Domestic relations court probably, in my opinion, would be at the top of the list because of safety, security, and service issues. The housing court actually has people working in hallways in the Justice Center because they don't have space, and I think they're adding another magistrate, and we don't know where they're going to go. The prosecutor has been overcrowded for years with 2 people in an office that was a small office to begin with for 1 person. I hope I'm not, okay, thank you, Mr. O'Malley. And do we consider swing space for tower renovation so that we can start that renovation right away, either through new construction, or do we temporarily relocate some non-direct court functions, probation, even the prosecutor, to give us some breathing room in that building to allow renovation to begin, rather than wait for new construction for swing space? Do we look at the renovation of the old courthouse and potentially using any space that we gained by moving domestic relations out to address a piece of the program? And then finally, can we accelerate that phased renovation of the courthouse tower? The last item we would share as an idea is, if in fact we decide that we need an annex to solve the functional needs of the court, can we look at an alternate site? Can we look at reuse of the PAB, though that would be affected by how long the city intends to lease it temporarily until their new police headquarters are done? Could we look at Huntington Park? We look at that site, and it's very easy to connect that site into the Justice Center and the old courthouse. The old courthouse is already connected underground to the Justice Center. It'd be very easy to have another connection to an annex on that site. Or the Courthouse Square site, which the county already owns a significant piece of. If we can find a way to accelerate the project, we cut 3 to 4 years of escalation off the front end of the project because we're not waiting for the jail to be complete, to be occupied, and to be demolished. So that's an overview of where we were in 2020, 2 years ago, 2 years later. Questions?
I think at this point in time, this is a point in time for some questions and thoughts for Andy. One of the things, there's a few things I would point out, and Andy, I'd like you can comment on these. Number one, if we proceed, the first thing I think that's important is to agree on priorities. If we can't do it all, and we have to do things on a phased basis, what are the priorities? And part of that is looking at the old 2013 assessment of the building and really figuring out what just has to happen and when does it have to happen? What can be delayed somewhat, and what is a phased method if we're going to continue to use the old building? Second of all, what are the priorities in existing needs? And just to kind of walk through something, by way of example, if priority number one is the domestic relations court, do we take and do something consistent with the long-term plan, but can we build out a place for the domestic relations court, either on one of those sites in the PAB, a different location, still consistent with everything else? If we do that and we share and we have space in the old courthouse, 60,000 square feet, can that become a great new office space for a function? Maybe, and I don't know this, maybe Mr. O'Malley would love beautiful new space right there in the old courthouse for expanded space for the prosecutor. Don't know if it is across the street, but that may be an option. There are ways to, and that wouldn't be inconsistent with the overall long-term approach. It would also free up 4 floors in the Justice Center for swing space for future operation. These are some of the things that have to start to be decided if that is the approach. Obviously, if it's a build new approach for an entire building on another block, that's another question, but it's a huge question because even if you get that number down, it's still many hundreds of millions of dollars that you have to plan for. So these are the questions, some of the questions that we have to think about as we move forward. They have to be thought through, they have to be prioritized. There has to be an understanding of a budget, because until we know the budget, it's kind of hard to understand how to prioritize that. And quite honestly, there also has to be an understanding, and I won't get into the middle of this, between the city and the county as to the city's participation in a joint project to do this. As you know, there's other models. You know, Franklin County, has separate courts. We've always talked about here having something consolidated, thinking that you could benefit from consolidation, and that's always an issue, something to look at. But the question is, how and when is a decision made as to how to participate? And of course, the question would be, okay, well, participation for what project and what cost? Understood. But all those issues have to be concurrently thought through. I don't know if you want to add to that, but I think at this point in time, it's important, while Andy's here in town, for you to, if you have any questions or any discussion you want to have just of this right now, I think this is a time to do that. So I'll just ask the panel if you have any questions or thoughts that you just want to offer at this stage.
My one comment really on behalf of prioritizing for the courts, and it's just a understanding I agree with you, Jeff. We need to know a budget so we know where the money, how we're going to comment and make these decisions. But I mean, I do believe that when you talk about shared jury rooms, shared facilities, and I just think that it's important. I mean, I'm one of 34, but we've got thousands of people who use that building that we need to incorporate to help make these decisions. And I just don't think it's simply just saying, well, we're going to prioritize and this is what we're going to do it. And I just think that maybe there should be a subcommittee, maybe, of the court's users that would look at these priorities, and then come back to this committee and talk about what we can and can't do, what we believe would be best use of prioritizing the space in the Justice Center. Just a thought.
Well, I think it's key that we have an understanding, as you indicate, what is the budget. And in the last 10 years, this county has strayed further and further away from its priorities, its core functions, which used to be courts, the sheriff's department, processing deeds, collecting taxes, working on county roads and bridges, adequately staffing the medical examiner's office. And in the last 10 years, we have seen a shift in much of the county's capital, and much of our borrowing ability be shifted to arenas, stadiums, hotels, convention centers, microgrids, and things that are not within the core functions. The priority of this county has to be its core functions. And I don't know what borrowing ability we have. Certainly the sheriff has absolute needs in his jail. And I think everybody agrees that that's the priority. But then what is left for the courts? And we don't have that answer. So it's very difficult to really plan our next move without that understanding. So that's my first issue, is to where are we at, and where we go. Second of all, I think it's critical for each of the shareholders in each of these buildings. I think if you look at the old county courthouse, I see Judge Celebrezze here, Judge Russo's out in the audience. Who am I missing? Domestic. What's that? Yeah, but those individuals need to get together and decide what is best for the Old County Courthouse, and then make a recommendation to the group as a whole as to their issues. I think when we look at the Justice Center, we've got to bring in the Cleveland Municipal Court, Judge Early, Judge Scott, the clerk, Judge Sheehan, myself, because we are the principal occupants, and we really have to figure it out and then make our recommendations so that we as a committee can come to the right decision. And it's going to take time, but I think all of that starts with what are our finances? And as I sit here today, I really don't have a clue. And I do look, I know we're about to spend, and this is what troubles me. We have both a arena and stadium that were 25 years old that hundreds of millions were pumped into. We have a global center that's like 9 years old that we're talking about putting 48 million into. This Justice Center, I think, is 47 years old, and we really haven't done a whole lot of anything to it. And again, it's about priority. And to me, the priority of the county needs to be the core functions. And that message has to be received by the people who occupy this building, because I think over the last 10 years, it's been forgotten.
Gallagher?
I do not disagree with the prosecutor in total, but financially, am I hearing correctly that if we went with either the redo or a new build, we're basically looking at about 7 years out?
Andy, schedule-wise, if we went with, well, it depends on when you could
I
get the
won't hold
site.
you to it. Ballpark it new, ballpark it redo.
The way that it would take us to get it done, to find the site, I think that's probably accurate.
If that's the case, financially, the county can afford it. If that's the case, with the jail, it seems to be, we get to a fish or cut bait moment, and we're at that moment with the city of Cleveland. And while many of the administration people are new, the mayor's new, the council president's new, the judges have been here and participating in this process. We have to know what their position is before these discussions about the core of what we need to be doing goes on. I would also agree I think people in this building need to be much more careful in what we do with our bonding. By picking up the bonding on the baseball stadium was the most ludicrous thing I've ever seen in my life. The arena was ours. We had to do that. The ballpark's Cleveland. Why we picked it up, I have no idea. But that's $200+ million that we picked up that should be going to the core of what we're here to do. I could talk about that because I voted against it because I just didn't like it. I just didn't think we could afford it for that and what we have to do. So the fish or cut bait moment, what's Cleveland doing? Where are they at? Are they in? What's their cost? And we had this discussion, you're saying probably about 30%. If they can get a roundabout figure of what it's going to cost them to be knee deep in this, then we can have these discussions, these broad discussions. Because if they're not, and they decide to go on their own, spend their $200 million or whatever that cost is to provide for their courts, that brings our costs down, and the ability for us to handle that is much easier. But people aren't factoring in Cleveland's cost on this. So the county can handle it if it's a 7-year out project with the jail. But, and the one thing I think you're missing there, and it's true, if we built new somewhere else, we got to buy property. I was told before the convention center, before the hotel, before any of the amenities over there, that property was some of the most valuable in downtown Cleveland. So I would imagine that's a wash. If you're buying property, it's a wash. And if we redo it there, then it's a wash anyhow. So we're not worried about that cost. But I think the main thing is we have to know what Cleveland's doing. We should have known what Cleveland was doing 2 years ago. And the council, I can tell you, has been telling the administration, we really think you need to get moving on this. And then last year with the mayor leaving and new mayor coming in, that kind of screwed that up. So here we are, we have to put it on their table. We have to know what they're doing.
The information that we can supply is we can take the programming, all the programming that has been done. We can separate, and keep in mind there's two kinds of issues. There's pure city functions, and then there's the shared common area, which is where, by the way, you would get, some savings because you're sharing common area. But we can take the data that we have and all the information, we can break down what is the pure county area, if you will, what is the pure city area and function, and then what is the common area, which would be, a ratio. And we can get that specifically to everybody, just so you'll know, for purposes of discussion, what that is, which would be, a step in actually getting that understanding. So we can provide that. Yes.
Yeah, Jeff and Andy, first of all, I want to just say thank you for taking the time, and I want to say thank you to you for recognizing that there is sticker shock here, and that this is definitely a heavy lift as we look at it and we compare the price tags that you've brought to us with the needs and the decision here. And I also want to thank Councilman Gallagher and Prosecutor O'Malley for their comments as well, and recognizing that the county and others want to know where the city stands. And so with respect to that, let me say that we are in the middle of some revenue uncertainty, because with the advent of remote work, we are not sure about what that will do to our tax base. And so while we hear the need for an answer quickly from the city, we can tell you that there are certain aspects of ambiguity that we cannot magically wave away. We don't know what's going to happen to our revenue base because we haven't seen what the tax revenues are yet. And we're going to try to work through that and find that. But we can't get you an answer quickly. We can't make certainty appear for the future. We have no crystal ball with respect to finances. And I appreciate that is frustrating for everyone who's been involved in this project for 2 years, 3 years, or more. But I think none of us anticipated COVID, and none of us anticipated the changes that have been made to our economy. The mayor just delivered a budget and transition plan. And let me tell you that expenditures for a courts tower was not part of that plan. It was not something that was anticipated. The mayor spent, a year and a half talking to the people of Cleveland, and they talked to him about the issues that were important to him. They talked to him about the carjackings and the core functions that Prosecutor O'Malley referenced about making sure we have enough police officers on the streets. I can promise you that no one came to him and said, we need to spend hundreds of $millions on a courts tower. So we need to recognize that whatever the price tag is, whatever the lift is, it's a really big challenge. It's a big challenge for the city of Cleveland because of our uncertainty. It's also a big challenge because we are the poorest big city in America. So to make that change, and in terms of evaluating what our priorities are, that is a big issue. And this was not something that appeared on the priorities of the transition report or in the mayor's budget, but we also recognize that there are dynamics here that need to be addressed. But part of that has to do with, because of the sticker shock and because of the issues that you brought forward, I would ask for some more creative alternatives. And so as we talk about some of these functions, and we've talked about possibly putting them into an annex or doing other things in order to then expand and renovate, I guess I would ask a couple questions. One is, did anyone consider the possibility of purchasing a downtown office building? I was looking, and apparently all of Key Tower was sold 5 years ago for $267 million. What used to be called the BP America building was sold for about $187 million. And I appreciate that those are different office spaces. They're different than courts. But before the Justice Center was opened, judges practiced in the Mott building, which was just across the street. It was a traditional office building. But given our priorities, given the level of the cost, I would ask to evaluate different alternatives and try to be creative with this to the extent possible.
I would just point out that is one of the alternatives. Andy kind of went over it fairly quickly, but yes. And let me make a statement about that. And I think we've said this before in other meetings, but courthouse construction and courthouse space is very expensive space. It's expensive because you necessarily have high ceilings, the grandeur of the building. When you put a office function, now I understand, keep in mind that those that operate in the courthouse want their staff close. On the other hand, when you build put office functions on a courthouse floor, that's extremely expensive construction. So one of the options, and it's done in other jurisdictions, is to take office functions, have it very close by, perhaps even, side by side, but to take office functions in an office building, and by the way, if there's one available, you can buy it, you can lease it, but that will substantially reduce cost versus putting those office functions in a court building. Is that an accurate statement? And it is one thing that we have talked about and considered, but once again, that's something that there's going to have to be a consensus of individuals who are willing to go that direction. But yeah, there's ways you can save money doing that for sure.
And I also want to say thank you for looking at some of the comments that Andy and I had with respect to the financial piece and making sure everything was in today's dollars as opposed to a mix of today's dollars and future dollars increased at 5%, which seemed to me a little not consistent. So thank you, Andy, for that.
Thank you. Yes.
So, just apologize for being tardy today, but one of the things we're just going over is the budget. And to Chief Griffin's point, we're only anticipating to probably do about $50 million in bonds this year in order to put capital for the city. We're reaching to that capacity, so these are going to be some tough decisions. I'm sorry.
Nobody, can you hear me now? I think, okay, there we go. So just going over the budget, we're anticipating probably about $50 million in bonding this year or something around that year in order to go towards capital. So just to give you that number, and Chief Griffin is right, I don't think building money for the jail is going to this year. So that is something that's going to be a tough decision-making process. So just to let you know that.
And that's not a surprising statement, which is why, this is a process. No one's asking, for a decision today or tomorrow, but as Mr. Gallagher pointed out, there's a time frame for getting this done, and we're going to have to get to those solutions and then think about the future funding commitment for that. So, the biggest problem, and I know that everyone sees this, is every year we don't know what we're doing. We continue to pour money in the building, which may or may not be a good investment if we do something different, with parts of that building. So that's the other issue. But understood.
Jeff? I might just add, I think everybody's got valid points that they're raising right now, but more importantly, for the county to plan properly and move down the road on this process, I agree with Mr. Gallagher. We got to know what Cleveland's doing. Are they in or are they out? And so understanding the issues they have before them completely, but we need to set a deadline. I mean, I agree. We had to have that decision a long time ago. And we can't plan for, and fluctuate the square footage in the buildings that we're doing without them or with them. We got to make a decision. And I think what we can do is, and be fair to the city as best we can, but let's get a date, a time. Here's the decision time, and then we know. And then we can plan appropriately. But everybody's got their issues, though. I get it.
And I think that from the city's perspective, in order to know how and when to make a decision, what information do you need to make that decision? And, you're going to have to digest. I know that for the two of you, I know this is, you're now drinking from the fire hose here. But we'll have to give you, the background, the information that you need. Once again, there's been a significant amount of work that has been done to date that informs the decision. But you're exactly right. We're going to have to, you can't go forward and plan unless you know a few key fundamental elements about it. And that even gets to the whole budget. The budget for what? For a combined facility or for a single facility. So that's true. Other discussion right now. Other comments, other thoughts. Obviously, we're going to get back into some working group sessions on this, and we'll continue to, in different ways, continue to advance the discussion here. But in this steering committee, I just wanted to see if there's anything else at this stage that you wanted to discuss on this before we move on to the last few parts of the meeting.
Jeff, I would just ask that we do, the people who are in control of the county budget, the fiscal department, give us an estimate, what's available, when it's going to be available, so at least we have an understanding of what timeline might be reasonable to progress with this project, because, right now I don't have a clue. And so we may be meeting and we may have no ability to do anything at this particular point in time. So I think we're all very busy, and I think the first step that we need to understand is, what are we dealing with? So until we know what we're dealing with, this is a very difficult process.
It's an impossible process until you have some fundamental things known. And the problem right now is we're at a point where, we can't move forward without a few very fundamental things. One of which is, these are you may recall that even from the early day, I put down those 3 big decision points that we needed. And, one of them was, what is going to be the city-county arrangement is one of them. One of them is, what is the budget, overall budget? I understand that's driven by what is the city-county arrangement. The only thing we can do right now is we can supply all the information that can inform that decision. And I think we also have to make sure we understand from everyone's perspective what additional information they might need. I think we've done as much as we can to supply the background. I will say one thing that probably needs to be some attention to, and that is that 2013 assessment is old, and we probably have to just make sure that we are still accurate, because money has gone into the facility, but there's other places where money where there's other needs, and so we have to update that a little bit, and we should talk about that. Because it's really not even the 2014 assessment, it's the 2013 assessment. The 2014 assessment had options. That's 8 years old now. A lot has happened in those 8 years. Other comment right now?
Jeff?
Yes.
I'll provide anybody that needs it, our bonding capacity. We're at, if I remember correctly, and don't quote me, 1.2 to 1.4. Today, that was before the Cleveland baseball team deal, which again, we have to prioritize, and why we picked that up will forever remain a mystery. We'll provide that. That's ultimately, that comes down to the county council. And like I said, with the jail, and Cleveland isn't participating in the jail, just a justice center for the courts. So that's a set aside. We would like to supplement that, obviously, and we're discussing with the administration what to do. So right now, if it's a 7-year-out project, I'm comfortable we can handle it, but more revenue obviously is ideal. So we have to figure that out.
Understood. Thank you.
Just thank you all for your attention, and thanks to all the working groups that we've had Zoom meetings with and a lot of in-person meetings before. There's been a lot of participation from everybody, and it's much appreciated. Thank you.
And I will say, Judge Sheehan, even though you say you have 34 opinions, I sat in all 3 of the working group sessions with your judges, and they were absolutely all completely in line with your vision.
I don't know if that's a compliment or not. Thanks, Jeff.
Okay, we have a few more things to accomplish here. It's not advancing. Okay, we're going to do just a very quick comment by Mike Dever as to what's going on the site selection.
Thanks. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for coming again today. I had been before you within the last 2 months here and giving you updates on the jail site selection process. As you know, we had shortlisted down to 5 sites, and we are still investigating those sites. At the same time, we had put out an RFP to see what was out in the market within Cuyahoga County that could meet the criteria that we had put together and had been approved by this committee. And that RFP closed on Monday. We did receive one proposal. We are now evaluating that proposal, and my hope is to come back to you in the near future, possibly in an executive session, to give you an update on that. But I just wanted to let you know that we have one additional proposal that came in through the RFP process. So that's pretty much my update on that. Any questions?
Okay, Jeff. Okay, and for public comment, I think Will, you had either a comment or a question.
Thank you very much. William Tarter from Broadview Heights. Just a question, as we've discussed about the historic courthouse, I was curious if any research has been done on historic preservation grants that might be available that would drive down the cost of any potential renovations. That was just a question I wanted to ask as we're proceeding today. Thank you very much.
Anyone know that? Jeff, do you know if there was any?
Well, it's actually, it's a very good question, by the way. And one of the things that we have not yet talked about are there alternate methods and, depending on what we do, alternate sources of funding. So let me just say that that's a good question, and it's something that we can address. I don't want to address it right now. I have to be careful because I am the consultant. I'm not allowed to be the lawyer for the project, so I don't want to give legal advice right now. But it is a good question and something I think that we can talk about a little bit more in the future. Thank you. I think so. On next steps, I have been asked. There's a few members of the steering committee that have asked to have a conversation or discussion and be heard on next steps. We do not have right now the date for the next steering committee meeting. But the next steering committee meeting, I will tell you that what is, aside from continuing on with this discussion, we will be, we are doing a lot of work, as you can imagine, on the jail right now. We're moving through schematic design. We hope that the next time we come back to the steering committee, we'll have a lot more knowledge and information about where we are on site. And that will be an important consideration. But we have not determined the date. And there's also the issue of the location of the steering committee meetings. And I think both Judge Sheehan and Mr. O'Malley just wanted to be heard a little bit on our process going forward.
Well, here, I personally, I love this chambers. I think this is a nice setup. It's very technology friendly and accessible. I just, it just caught me off guard. We're talking about the Justice Center and we're at the council chambers, and it just thought, we should move these meetings around. I don't know if, cost is a factor. I get it. Electronics and technology is a matter of something to be concerned about. I just think wherever we meet, it's a committee decision, and that's all I was hoping. It's not just here we are, and that's all. I just thought when we're talking about the Justice Center, I thought it was odd. We're not at the Justice Center. Just a thought. Mike?
I would concur. I think if you look around this table, a majority of the committee members are from the Justice Center or from Cleveland City Hall or from Courthouse Square. So we're pretty much very proximate to that location or the Global Center. And I understand the Global Center comes with a cost, but on the significance of my issues, that's probably a 1.
Great.
Yeah, our cost is a concern to the council, always is and always will be. We built this building for things like this. I know it's a little bit of an inconvenience for those to the north, but this is a great convenience to the taxpayers, and the taxpayers trump the inconvenience to anybody in this, on this panel. So going forward, short of somebody picking up the $4,000 or $5,000 from their budget, this is a freebie. Everybody here parked for free. When we go to the Justice Center, we don't park for free. My staff pays. There's no reimbursement. So, and I'm not arguing for my staff. We don't have a problem eating that. And I do understand the inconvenience, but we do also provide all the amenities that this committee would need, with breakout rooms, a secure chamber for executive sessions. We have overflow in the back. We have social distancing. We've had upwards of 200 people in this room without problem. If it is a matter of safety, I don't see it. If it's a matter of convenience, I understand that. Having worked in the courthouse and the convenience of that, but with public access and the technology that we provide, we've not had one of these meetings that's been out over the internet that's been clean. I guarantee you this one was clean.
And I want to just make so it's clear, the convention center, when we do it at the Global Center, they provide the room for free, but the technology is a cost of to do that setup's about $3,000 a meeting. So I just want to be clear that it's not that you're paying for the space, but it's a technology vendor that has to be used there when it's done there. So I understand there's a difference of view on this, and I'm just going to continue to look. By the way, I can't ask for a vote on this because it's not a determination, and I'm glad that I can't ask for a vote on this. But yes,
Jeff, I got a quick question, and I just received a text. It's come to my attention, so I know the county council has to vote on the Global Center, but one of the issues that, and I raised this issue with you this morning, is the need for the court to have the ability for jurors to gather due to the pandemic in the Global Center. And it's critical to the court function. And as you know, and the sheriff would tell you, there's nothing more critical than getting people out of the county jail, which requires us to conduct jury trials for both criminal cases and then as well as the court's need for civil cases as well. And due to the pandemic, they've been using the Global Center. Now, it's my understanding that the administration, even though it still does need council approval, is gearing up to go full go on moving forward on the renovation of the Global Center. I would say two things. First and foremost, we're back to the discussion regarding critical functions of county government. And we're looking at spending upwards of $30 million in county funds for that project. And as this discussion has illustrated, there's concerns about going forward. And that building was built 9 years ago, maybe 10 years ago. And the thought I have of putting another $48 million into it while we're having a discussion regarding a critical facility is, I question the judgment on that decision. So I think, first and foremost, that building continues to need to be made available for jurors into the foreseeable future. And I would ask them to be cognizant of the needs of the people who are housed in the Justice Center, all those offices, and the old courthouse, that before another $48 million is spent, that they pause and realize critical functions also need some capital. Thank you.
let me, only
Jeff,
because I have
Jeff,
personal, yes, sir.
I can tell you, of the members of council I talked to, that's not a popular plan. But I think the consensus is it's a discussion we need to have with the incoming administration.
I was just going to add a couple things only because I have some personal knowledge of that situation. Number one, there is nothing about that plan that would impact what's going on the fourth floor. That plan, even if it went forward, goes through a design phase, and it wouldn't impact those operations on the fourth floor. Second of all, the plan is a plan that is basically the recommendation of the board of the CCCFDC. It is Destination Cleveland did there were two studies, and it emanates from that. That was not something that came from the administration down. It was something that the CCFDC has come to the county on, and to my knowledge, it's not something yet that there's any action or recommendation that's been made by Mr. Budish. Certainly nothing's gone before council. So that is not a county, that's not a county driven request. That is something that the board of CCCFDC and Destination Cleveland and others have proposed. So I don't know if you want to say something further about that, Mr. Budish.
Yeah, I'll just second what you just said. Despite the plain dealer and the Cleveland.com obviously thinking that the CCCFDC is somehow part of the county government that is in the executive realm, the fact is that, as Jeff said, that was a recommendation by the CCCFDC board. There's been absolutely no determination. In fact, there hasn't even been a conversation with council about it. So, it's way premature to be talking about whether we're going to put more money into the Global Center or not. And I don't think it impacts at all whether we have meetings over there or not. I mean, it's just apples and oranges. But I do want to make it clear, there has been no decision, no recommendation. It's not being driven by the administration, contrary to Cleveland.com, and it's not being driven by Mr. Applebaum.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And I do believe the county council will give it good scrutiny, but like I said, I received information that the project may be going forward. Obviously, that needs council approval, and I just think given what we discussed here today, we really have to focus on our critical needs.
And I'll also say my role in that project is only to say, if you were going to build it, how would you do it? As always, my role is just to try to facilitate decisions that are made. And I have that's a decision to be made by others. So, but in terms of the issue of location, we'll continue to have discussions about it. Maybe they're all done here. Maybe you rotate. I don't know. But there is the issue of the cost, and there is the issue of the parking. So to consider. With that in mind, unless there is any other business here, I would ask for a motion to adjourn. And a second? Second. All in favor? Opposed? Okay, we are adjourned. Thank you very much for